For 34 years, the brutal murder of Blanche Kimball was little more than a ghost story in Augusta, Maine. It was a dusty cold case file, a deep wound for a family that had no answers, and a local legend with no real suspect. Back in 1976, investigators had almost nothing to go on, and as the years stretched on into decades, any hope of finding the person responsible seemed to just fade away. But the killer made one tiny, almost unnoticeable mistake, a mistake that would sit silently in an evidence locker for over 3 decades, just waiting for one piece of technology that could finally make it talk. And the key that would unlock this entire mystery wasn't going to be a dramatic confession or a long-lost witness. Nope, it would be something you could buy at any corner store for a quarter, a single piece of chewing gum. It all started on June 12, 1976, when police were called to a modest home on State Street in Augusta. Neighbors were worried they hadn't seen their friendly 70-year-old neighbor Blanche Kimball for a few days, which was out of character for a kind and sociable widow. When the officers went inside, they found a scene of absolute horror. Blanche Kimball, a retired dental technician and a practical nurse, was found dead in her kitchen. The scene told a grim story of a desperate fight. There was broken glass on the floor and blood stained the cabinets, the walls, and even the lampshades. An autopsy would later confirm she had been stabbed more than 2,000 times in a brutal, violent attack. The investigation was frustrating from the jump. What was strange was there was no sign of a break-in. This told police that Blanche probably knew her killer and likely even let them into her home. She was known to take in boarders for short stays to help make ends meet. Detectives collected what little evidence they could, include blood samples and a knife found at the scene. They interviewed everyone they could think of, trying to piece together Blanche's last days. One of the people they talked to was a young man named Gary Robb, who was using the name Gary Wilson at that time. He had rented a room from Blanche and was interviewed twice. He denied any involvement, and with nothing to hold him on, he was let go. Within few years, he left the state, and as far as an investigation was concerned, he basically fell off the face of the earth. The trial went cold almost as soon as it began, leaving a family heartbroken and a community with a dark, unanswered question. 34 years. Think about that. It's a lifetime. For 3.5 decades, the file on Blanche Kimball's murder sat in cold case unit of a Maine State Police. Babies born the day she died grew up and had their own families, all while her killer walked free. For Blanche's family, the time did nothing to heal the wound. It just made the pain of not knowing, of having no justice, even sharper. Detectives came and went over the years. Every so often, someone would pull the file, hoping a fresh set of eyes might get something everyone else had missed. They'd reread the old statements and study the crime scene photos, and every single time they'd hit the same brick wall. In a world before DNA, the evidence just wasn't enough. The name Gary Robb, the former brother, was just one of many in a file thick with dead ends. He had vanished, and with nothing concrete to tie him to crime, he was a ghost. The case just became a sad piece of a local history, a grim reminder that sometimes the bad guys get away with it. And then science changed everything. Suddenly we had DNA analysis and the combined DNA index system, or CODIS. For the first time, investigators could take decades-old biological evidence, a drop of blood, a single hair, and pull a unique genetic profile from it. If that profile matched someone in the National Database of Convicted Offenders, a case that had been frozen for decades could suddenly get red hot. Fast forward to 2011, a persistent Maine State Police detective named Abby Chabot, who had actually taken over the case back in 2003, decided it was time to give this new tech a shot. She submitted the evidence that had been so carefully preserved since 1976 for modern DNA testing, including the blood stains from the kitchen. The lab went to work, and the result was just astonishing. They successfully extracted a full male DNA profile from the killer's blood. It was a perfect sample, perfectly preserved for 34 years. Detective Chabot immediately ran the profile through CODIS, and then they got a hit. After 34 years of silence, the case finally had a voice. The DNA profile belonged to a man who had been required to submit a sample after a felony conviction years earlier. His name was Gary Robb. The former brother who had disappeared from Maine all those years ago had just reappeared in the most dramatic way possible. The ghost they'd been chasing was about to get a name. That CODIS hit blew the case wide open. Detectives suddenly had their first real lead in over 3 decades and started digging into who Gary Robb was now. After leaving Maine, he had drifted across the country, living a transient life and picking up a criminal record. Now at 63 years old, he was homeless and living on the streets of Seattle, Washington. The connection was impossible to ignore. Robb, who was 24 at that time of the murder, had been interviewed twice and then vanished. He was their prime suspect from the start, but now they had science to prove it. But there was a catch. The DNA they had was from the database. To build an airtight case of a murder trial, prosecutors needed a direct sample, fresh DNA taken from a suspect himself to compare directly against the crime scene evidence. They couldn't just walk up to Rob and ask him to swab his cheek. That would tip him off and give him a chance to disappear all over again. They needed to get his DNA without him knowing. They had to get creative. And that's when Maine's state police made a call to their colleagues 3,000 miles away in Seattle with a very unusual plan. What happened next is a masterclass in clever detective work. Knowing Rob was living in Seattle's University District, an undercover detective from Seattle Police Department was sent to make contact. He found Rob on a street and strolled up to him, not as a cop, but as a market researcher. He explained he was conducting a survey from a marketing company, getting feedback on different brands of cigarettes and chewing gum, and offered Rob $5 for his time. For a man living on streets, $5 was an easy roll. Rob agreed. The detective gave him a couple of cigarettes and then offered him a choice of gum. One account even says the detective knew Rob liked apple pie and made sure to have that flavor ready. Rob took a piece, unwrapped it, and started chewing while they chatted for a few minutes to keep up the act. When they were done, Rob split the gum into a piece of paper and tossed it in a trash, just like Detective hoped he would. He took his $5 and went on his way, totally clueless about what had really just happened. The second Rob was out of sight, the detective retrieved the piece of gum. It was carefully packaged and rushed to the Maine State Police Crime Lab. There, scientists extracted the saliva and generated a new DNA profile. It was a perfect match. The DNA on the gum from Seattle in 2012 was identical to killer's blood from Blanche Kimball's kitchen in 1976. They got him. After 34 long years, they finally had Blanche Kimball's killer. With the slam-dunk DNA match in hand, Maine State Police detectives flew to Seattle. In October 2012, they found and arrested Gary Robb for the murder of Blanche Kimball. The arrest was for the oldest cold case in Maine's history ever to result in a charge. Robb was extradited back to Maine to face justice. Facing a mountain of evidence, he entered what's called an Alford plea, a type of guilty plea where you don't admit to crime, but concede that the prosecutions had enough evidence to convict you anyway. He claimed he had no memory of that case 1976 incident because of an injury. In June 2014, Gary Robb was sentenced to 20 years in prison. For Blanche's family and the community, it was a moment of profound relief and closure. Decades in the making, justice, it turned out, hadn't forgotten Blanche Kimball. It was just waiting for a little help from science and a single piece of gum. Gary Robb died in prison in 2016 after serving about 2 years of his sentence. It's pretty remarkable, right? The sheer dedication of detectives who just refuse to let a case go cold. If you find these stories of justice served against all odds as fascinating as I do me a favor and subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a case. The murder of Blanche Kimball is such a powerful story about patience and progress. It's a proof that no case is truly hopeless as long as someone is willing to preserve the evidence. For 34 years, a killer walked free, probably believing he had gotten away with it, that his past was buried for good, but he could not outrun the future. He could not outrun his own DNA. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other cold cases files are sitting on a shelf right now, holding one tiny, unassuming clue like a piece of chewing gum, just waiting for its moment to finally bring a killer to justice. What do you think is the most incredible cold case solve you have ever heard of? Let me know in the comments below.